Obrigado, Miraldo. Boa noite a todos, boa noite a todas. Nós estamos começando a mesa de encerramento do nosso evento EPOGELLI, e a mesa tem o nome de Modernismos, diálogos transdisciplinares. Para estar com a gente aqui são os professores
Modernismos, diálogos transdisciplinares. Para estar com a gente.
E o Limário, fui eu que fiz uma bobagem aqui, que o YouTube entrou. A gente está com os professores Limário de Souza e a professora Sandra Vasconcelos, e a gente está pensando em média 30 minutos para cada um, né, de fala, mas vamos fazer uma coisa livre, não precisa ficar tão formal assim. O Lim pediu que eu avisasse faltando 10 minutos, e a Sandra falou que ela controla o próprio horário e tal. Obrigado a todos pela presença. A gente vai começar com o Lim. Lim, por favor. Acho que o seu som, Lim.
Boa noite a todos. Eu tenho uma apresentação para fazer, então já vou começar com isso agora. Dá para ver os slides? Tá. Okay, então, I'd like to approach the topic of modernity from decolonial perspectives, and this has to do with the research I've been doing in the last few years. And there's obviously, as you may know, there are various theories, decolonial theories. The important thing for me about these decolonial theories is we always have to localize, specify, particularize where we're speaking from. So I'm speaking here located at this public institution of USP from São Paulo, Brazil. From my research in post-colonial, decolonial theories, from myself as an applied linguist and as a linguist as well, and from my interests in education. So for me, it's important to emphasize what I consider to be strategies of decolonial critique from my own perspective here. And this comes from my particular work. And I identify the strategies of identifying coloniality, interrogating coloniality, and interrupting coloniality. I'll define coloniality in a minute. Two other things that I emphasize in my work are the importance of marking the unmarked, and I'll explain that in a minute, and bringing the body back. Now, coloniality is what various theorists refer to as the continuing effects of an officially ended colonization. So whereas political colonization may have been ended de facto, maybe decades or even centuries ago, the effects of this colonization continue. What kind of effects? The effects of social injustice, inequality, racism, etc., etc. So the coloniality refers to the continuing effects of colonization. It's not colonization. What do I mean by marking the unmarked? This refers to questioning any knowledge, theory, truth, which considers itself to be universal, abstract, decontextualized. And this is what in linguistics we call the unmarked, the normative. And so from a decolonial perspective, it's important to question, I believe, the unmarked and show that all our truths emanate from a particular location, from a particular socio-historic position. So all our truths are marked. And when they are unmarked, that refers to a history of inequality and power, which promotes one particular unmarked group of knowledges as being one particular marked group of knowledges as being unmarked. Bringing the body back, where does this come in? as bodies occupy space and have histories, because bodies are born and they live and they die. Bodies have their origin in other bodies. We have our parents, we have our communities, we have our families. So bodies are social. So we are never talking about individuality, an individual speaker. We are talking about, as speakers, as producers of knowledge, we occupy a social space, and this social space is traversed by various discourses, or if you like, ideologies. So bringing the body back involves identifying the social subject, the speaking subject, the subject which is producing knowledge, his or her economic, socio-historic location, and the role of this, the socio-historic context or location of the producer of knowledge in the production of knowledge. So to what effect that do my ideologies, my gender, my sexuality, or my profession, for example, affect the knowledge that I produce? Okay, now on to bearing that in mind. These are the strategies that I am using as I present the rest of my work here. Now, in relation to modernity, I'll begin with the concept of Enrique Dussel, the Argentinian thinker, who says that modernity is considered to be enlightened rational critique. This is what the Western perspective suggests. But what do they mean by enlightened, and what do they mean by rational? Dussel himself sees it in this way. He sees modernity, the concept of being modern, as a distancing from tradition. And if we consider it literally, we consider modernity literally as a distancing from tradition, then we can see that several modernities exist in various regions of the world at various times. So these are the examples that Dussel suggests: Aztec modernity, Islamic modernity, Indian modernity, Chinese modernity, etc., etc. However, what we come to call modernity with a capital M arises, according to Dussel's theories and decolonial theories in Latin American decolonial theories. Modernity with a capital M arises as a result of the 1492 European expansion across the Atlantic to the Americas. So whereas previous modernities, in the plural with a small m, were ecumenies, meaning civilizations, cultural worlds, whereas previous modernities were ecumenies, each existing on its own, modernity with a capital M involves an interconnection between various ecumenies in a world system in which one ecumeny, the European, establishes itself at the center of a network of other ecumenies at its peripheries. So when we speak about, according to Dussel, when we speak about modernity with a capital M, we are talking about a Eurocentric concept of modernity, which results from a history of colonization, European colonization across the Atlantic, which resulted in a network, or a world system, if you like, a network which interconnects various ecumenies or civilizations or various world concepts into a single interconnected world concept, at the center of which is the European ecumeny, the European concept of civilization. This, he says, results from the initial Iberian colonial conquests of the Americas and the commercial exploitation of the resources encountered, which later fed into the growing wealth and dominance of Western Europe and the appearance of capitalism. So for most modernities, Enlightenment meant a distancing from previous traditions. For Dussel, as a result of new cycles of colonization after the Iberian cycle of 1492, after these new cycles of colonization and capitalism in Western Europe, what occurred was not simply a distancing from the past traditions of Europe. Western modernity emphasized development, rationality, and science, and distanced itself not only from the other ecumenies in its network, which it's important to remember, these other ecumenies in Latin America, which was not Latin yet, in the Americas, in Africa, in Asia, these other ecumenies from the regions colonized by Europe contributed to Europe, the dominance of Europe. So within this Western concept of modernity, Europe didn't only distance itself from its peripheries, but also distance itself from a European periphery. Southern Europe, it tends to forget that it owed the appearance of Western modernity to the initial colonization of Iberia, by Iberia of the Americas. So for Dussel, Western modernity violently hides the role played by its peripheries in its self-construction. Not only its extra-European peripheries, but also its European peripheries. So there is a violence at the basis of European modernity with a capital M. Now, another decolonial thinker, Ramon Grossfogel, says this decolonial critique of modernity is not a question of looking for an essentialist, fundamentalist, anti-European critique. What it does is it seeks a perspective that is critical both of Eurocentric and third world fundamentalisms, critical of colonialism and critical of nationalisms. It proposes a border thinking, and I'll describe this in a minute. It proposes a border thinking as a critical response to both hegemonic and marginal fundamentalisms. And what are fundamentalisms? They are the premise, or they emanate from the premise that there is only one epistemic tradition from which to achieve truth and universality. So fundamentalisms emphasize singularities. They don't take into account heterogeneities or networks of interconnected epistemic traditions. So what is border thinking and decolonial transmodernity? Firstly, Dussel proposes, as a response to the singularity and the violence of Western modernity, the violence through which it hides its connections and its influences, and what all that it owes to other knowledges and epistemologies. Dussel proposes a decolonial transmodernity. So he's not proposing an anti-modernity, he's proposing a transmodernity to replace Eurocentric modernity. This does not involve rejecting the Eurocentric concepts of rationality and science, which are the bases of Western European modernity. It calls, the transmodernity calls for the recognition of the interconnection with the peripheries of modernity and their contributions to modernity, such as the contributions of Islamic knowledge in Iberia to Western science. It calls for the recognition that though theories may be generated in the global north, they result from multidisciplinary research and resources originating in the global south. In my particular area, for example, linguistics, applied linguistics. As we know, when we speak of linguistics, we speak of Saussurean linguistics, and we even call Ferdinand de Saussure as the father of modern linguistics. Here, what are we doing? We're involved in a typical gesture of Western modernity. We are saying that linguistics, or a thinking of language, begins with the European Ferdinand de Saussure. This is not true. We have Asian and African thinking of language, Sanskrit thinking of language, for example, which begins thousands of years before Saussure. So this is just an example of how transmodernity is not calling for a silencing of European modernity. It's calling for a recognition of the existence of other modernities, other knowledges, which contributed to European modernity and are interconnected with European modernity. So the trans in transmodernity refers to connections between the various modernities in various areas that were colonized specifically by Western Europe. It calls for the end of violence in excluding and hiding knowledges, beings and languages outside the West, and points to the irrationality of the violence of this exclusion, despite the claim that the West is moved by rationality. Another thinker, the Portuguese thinker Boaventura de Sousa Santos, for example, doesn't talk about transmodernity, but he says something similar. He uses the concept of an ecology of knowledges. Again, he says that the West produced what he called an abyssal line which separates Western knowledge from all other knowledges, especially of the areas that it colonized. And this abyssal line, in spite of recognizing the existence of other subaltern knowledges on the other side of the line, it silences these subaltern knowledges and proposes itself as the only existing knowledge on one side of the line. So what Boaventura proposes is we don't put an end to the abyssal line. What we do is we make the other side of the abyssal line visible and promote the interconnection between both sides of the abyssal line. And this brings in the diversity, the plurality, the heterogeneity, and also the complexity, the conflict, the inequalities, but in the plural. It calls for the recognition of multiple concepts of time that exist. So when we talk about development and progress, we are talking about a specific European linear concept of time. There are other concepts of time. For example, in indigenous cultures here in our own Brazil, time is considered to run at simultaneous parallel layers. So the past is not something that is gone. The past coexists with the present and the future. So what transmodernity calls for is to bring in these other forms of knowledges to dialogue with Western modernity. Now we're going from the concept of transmodernity, the concept of border thinking. So whereas transmodernity was a concept of Enrique Dussel, the Argentinian, border thinking is a term used by Walter Mignolo, who happens to also be an Argentinian, another thinker of decolonial theory. So here Mignolo says, again, border thinking doesn't seek to invert or oppose itself to Western modernity. Border thinking is a thinking of modernity, its reason and its science from the perspective of the margins or peripheries of Western modernity. So border thinking is to think the epistemologies of the colonial West from the epistemologies of the South. It calls attention to the fact that one doesn't think from nowhere. One thinks from one's locus of enunciation, meaning one's socio-historic context. So border thinking involves thinking hegemonic Western modernity and its reason and science from the non-hegemonic modernities, reasons and sciences of the peripheries. Again, in an effort to desingularize. This contributes to marking the unmarked, and as I'd said before, whereas the unmarked proposes itself as a singularity, as the only norm, the marking of the unmarked is necessary to make the fact visible that there are many competing norms. So we make the universal local, or as other thinkers have used the term, we provincialize the North. Now, what do we mean by locus of enunciation? Thinking from somewhere. This is a term developed by various thinkers, among them Bakhtin, Baba, Grossvogel, Mignolo, etc. The socio-historic context, it refers to the socio-historic context that constitutes the thinking social subject. So the thinking subject is not an individual, The thinking subject is always socially constituted. Socially constituted because he's born, he or she, or whatever, is born into a context traversed by multiple discourses, which coexist and may often be conflicting. This context of multiple coexisting discourses is also subject to time. So not only are these discourses multiple, but each and all of these discourses are also changing with time. So all knowledge and thinking is marked, because where we're speaking from a particular moment of history. We're speaking from a particular context in which we are, as social subjects, we are constituted by particular discourses. So all our knowledge and thinking is marked because it emanates from a socio-historically located body. Now, to end, I'd just like to give an example of border thinking from a Brazilian perspective, and here I'm referring to the work of a popular in the sense of non-academic, non-elite thinker, Antonio Bispo, or as he's also known, Mestre Bispo, who's a quilombola from Quilombo in Piauí, and who's very verbal. Though he doesn't publish, he speaks a lot. You can find his work on YouTube. He questions coloniality and Western modernity in Brazil, speaking always from his location as a quilombola in his particular quilombo. So one of his essential presuppositions is that quilombos are persecuted because they think differently. If you remember the history of quilombos were the sign of, were established by enslaved Africans who escaped slavery, escaped enslavement, and so quilombos are a sign of resistance. Right? They remind us that contrary to official history, resistance to slavery, enslavement existed throughout its history. So quilombos are persecuted, according to Bispo, because they think differently. They represent a way of thinking which hegemonic thinking does not accept. Quilombo culture for him, for example, this is how it thinks differently, is cosmological. It establishes what he calls alianza cósmica, a cosmic alliance, not separating the human from the non-human, nature from man. So Quilombo thinking is not humanistic Western modern thinking. It is something else. He calls it cosmological. So colonial culture or Western modernity for Antonio Bispo is cosmophobic. It uses nature as a resource and not a source. Cosmophobic because it refuses to see the interconnectivity of the various elements in nature, basically human and non-human or more than human. And in this sense, it is cosmophobic. It sees nature as not only a resource, but also a threat, because nature is not rational, and modernity emphasizes rationality. Another aspect of Antonio Bispo's border thinking or parallel modernity is he criticizes Western modernity as saying it believes in synthetic knowledges. Synthetic knowledges are those produced by Western science, which refer to separation, isolation, decontextualization. So this is what we call, in our academic thinking, scientific methodology. We first isolate a particular element, then we analyze it, and analyzing means breaking it down into its different parts. Then we try to understand describe each part, and then we try to synthetically reconnect the parts and to understand how they work together. So all of this thinking for Bispo is based on taking things apart, separation, isolation, decontextualization. So it's based on destruction. on not connecting. And he compares this or contrasts this with a different, the Quilombola version of modernity, which sees knowledge as organic, interconnected, always contextualized. And it assumes that there is knowledge even produced by non-human or more than human subjects, not just spirits, but also plants and nature. They think, they communicate. They are not non-living beings. Now, again, the Quilombola modernity, according to Antonio Bispo, finally emphasizes confluence and contrasts confluence with transfluence. Confluence is assimilation. It's the Western concept, and the democratic, we are living this today in this country, right? Confluence is the idea that in an election, everything comes together. This is the basis of our segundo turno. Everything comes together and we end up with a majority, and it's the voice of the majority that becomes singular and unique. So the predominant idea of confluence in Western modernity is bringing everything together. So we are all human, we all have nature, all our concerns with the climate are that we all live on the same planet. So singularity is always emphasized, as opposed to the Quilombola modernity, which emphasizes transfluence, interconnectivity. And an example of this that Bispo gives, he says, for example, what is our connection in Brazil with Africa? We are connected, but it's not by crossing the ocean or whatever. We are connected through nature. So, for example, it rains in our rivers in Brazil, it rains on the rivers in Africa. Where does the rain come? From the evaporation of the rivers, the water in the rivers, which then rains down into the rivers and causes the rivers to flow into the ocean. So the African rivers and the Brazilian rivers flow both into the Atlantic Ocean. So the Atlantic Ocean at the same time is not only where the rivers come together, it also produces the condensation which generates the rain on both sides of the Atlantic. So transfluence refers to the interconnectivity, which doesn't mean becoming the same. So it's not assimilation. It's connectivity which maintains like a bridge. It joins and yet keeps apart at the same time. And so just to end, I'll just refer to, so you get a feel of what Antonio Bispo means by his concept of modernity and how different it is to ours, our Western concept of modernity with a capital M. He says, não me mandem fazer direito, eu não sou colonizado. Fazer direito é submeter-se a uma norma externa. This would be the Western modernity. Fazer direito é submeter-se a uma norma externa. Falo tagarelando, escrevo mal, ortografado, canto desafinado, danço descompassado, só sei pintar borrando, meus desenhos são enviesados, esse é meu jeito, não me mandem fazer direito, eu não sou colonizado, vivas. So here he's calling not for a replacement or a substitution of Western modernity, he's calling for a recognition of the existence of other ways of doing things, other ways of thinking. So I'll just end with this. There are other modernities. All modernities are marked and all emanate from bodies or from specific locations. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lynn. Exactly 30 minutes. On time. Sandra, please.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to be so punctual and so exact in my presentation. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the students for inviting me to participate in this session. And it's a pleasure to be here with Lynn, whom I haven't seen for a while now. because of the pandemic, we don't meet people that frequently anymore. I think I'm going to read it's a paper I have. I haven't got any slides. I'm sorry about that. And my topic is not a very easy one either, as complicated as Lynn's, I think. And it's about Ulysses. Ulysses as a modern epic. So I'll be talking about Joyce's novel. And I hope to be able to use my 30 minutes, but I might, you need a bit more. Let's see. I'll try to do it fast. So Georg Lukács' The Theory of the Novel, and James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and Ulysses are products of the same historical period and context. Written in 1914 and 15, and first published in a periodical in 1916, and in book form in 1920, Lukács' study is very much a reflection that looks back on a world and a form that he felt had come to an end. And he himself states in the preface he wrote in 1962, this was the work of the pre-Marxist theorist, who would now point to what he saw as its distortions and limitations, and whose discussion about the novel had gone down the Marxist path. Throughout his life, the novel remained one of Lukács' main concerns, and his take on the genre would be aired in his books and collections of essays. Here, I draw not only on his early work, but also on some of his later publications in which he takes a controversial stance on the modernists. I refer specifically to the essay Narrate or Describe, published in 1936, and to The Meaning of Contemporary Realism, published in 1963, and the critique they offer of James Joyce. Joyce's novels, on the other hand, while rooted in their own present, not only embed a sense of crisis, but also look formally towards the future. In those years, Joyce's coming-of-age novel challenged the paradigmatic Bildungsroman with its implicit questioning of any possible reconciliation between man and the world. As an outcry against the nets of nationality, language, and religion, A Portrait would never deliver Stephen's Daedalus, and I quote Moretti here, functional integration in the social system. Stephen's discovery of his real vocation, his epiphany, if seemingly showing the path to adulthood, will nonetheless take him to exile and border on irresolution. Conceived amid the horrors of the catastrophe of the Great War, these three works, so Lukács' and Joyce's, clearly intimate an ongoing crisis that was both historical and literary. The old forms prevalent in the Victorian world could no longer render man's experience at a time of such significant changes and alarming conflicts. The promises of bourgeois society had proven to be unsubstantiated, and the novel, this most bourgeois of genres, had to grapple with new and unforeseen circumstances and problems. The shape and experience of modern life seemed to require a completely new response in terms of form. While A Portrait is a kind of Bildungsroman manqué, in which no reconciliation is possible, to borrow Moretti's interpretative terms, Bloom's wanderings throughout the streets of Dublin is a downgraded version of Odysseus' epic journey. Over a period of less than 24 hours, Joyce manages to compress the whole of Bloom's life story, Irish history, almost the entirety of English literature, an impressive range of sights, sounds, people, and places, and a complex net of social relations. Simultaneously resilient and mutable, The novel's sweep and pliability are such that they enable the inclusion of an extensive breadth of styles, subgenres, and materials. As Jess Matz argues, modernist novels are more concerned with, and I quote him, the true texture of real experience, and less with plot, which becomes, and I quote him again, deliberately minimal, often relatively pointless, largely anticlimactic, and loose enough to allow for the random openness of human existence. End of quotation. Ulysses has been pointed out as a striking example of the implosion of the novel genre. Joyce not only worked to broaden the concept of realism, but he also offered new configurations for the relationship between subject and object. All the elements and procedures entailed in what Ian Watt once defined as formal realism are at the same time deployed and challenged in the composition and representation of Leopold Bloom's Peregrinations in Dublin on the 16th of June, 1904. Like others of his contemporaries, Joyce would reshape the novel, embrace fragmentation, and seek new narrative strategies. This was a generation of novelists aware of the implausibility of omniscience and of the need to allow the reader to plunge into the character's mind. Leopold and Molly Bloom and Stephen Dedalus are therefore portrayed while engrossed in their innermost thoughts as they go about their daily business. The novel's immersion in and exploration of Bloom's subjectivity, while simultaneously drawing a broad canvas of Dublin life in the early 1900s, take the novel genre to a new, unprecedented level. Joyce made true his purpose of, and I quote him, in a conversation with Powers, of creating a new fusion between the exterior world and our contemporary selves, and also enlarging our vocabulary of the subconscious, as Proust had done. Thus, his move both availed itself of and flouted all the conventions as the novel genre had known them. He was conscious that the time demanded that writers probed the subterranean forces, those hidden tides which govern everything, a new way of thinking and writing that he called the new realism. It is this extraordinary welding together of a rich subjective life and the most banal events of human existence that anchors the novel in a palpable sense of the real world. Interior monologue as a consistent technique complements and counterpoints the circumstantial view of life, and I'm quoting Ian Watt here, that provides abundant details of time and place. Ulysses is so deeply embedded in the everyday that it is undeniably an immediate imitation of individual experience set in its temporal and spatial environment. Despite the Homeric resonances with which Joyce invests Bloom, Molly, and Stephen, not even for a moment do we doubt their individuality. They are three early 20th century Irish figures, mired in the web and flow of their present. As such, they face the crisis of their own existence in time and live the experience of transcendental homelessness, of which the novel form is the expression, as Lukács has contended. Like their 19th century counterparts, they too have lost the sense of feeling at home in an increasingly hostile and unfamiliar world. Unlike most of them, however, they will find no possible reconciliation with or in it. Homelessness assumes a very concrete form in the novel, but it also embodies symbolically the condition of the modern man. Out of and away from their dwellings, Bloom and Stephen are metaphorically homeless for most of the day, and while they wander about the city running various errands, Their isolation, anxieties, and doubts take center stage. If events are trivial and the plot is irrelevant, it is their impressions, the perceptions they have of the life and people around them that really matter and take precedence. While time and space are very specific, they are experienced and apprehended subjectively. We are placed in a zone of utmost closeness with the main characters by means of the consistent and pervasive use of interior monologue, thereby shortening or even abolishing epic distance. By practically deflating the role and importance of the narrator, Ulysses heightens the depiction of the present, lending the narrative a very dramatic and kinematic quality. As outsiders, Bloom and Stephen are far from typical or representative in the Lukácsian sense, but rather individual entities living their separate lives while they bear the weight of all the tensions and contradictions inherent in their society. Through fragmentation and detail, one day cut out in the flow of their existence, the totality of life emerges. Though Bloom and Stephen move about among the fixtures of the cityscape and in the hustle and bustle of urban Dublin, the feeling of paralysis that Joyce once suggested that permeated it takes hold of and dominates all its inhabitants and makes all of them part of one and the same historical experience. Therefore, invisible threads underlie the surface of the narrative and weave the nets that entrap the Irish people. As the main and secondary characters roam the streets, go places, and interact, from between the lines emerge the historical forces that have shaped Ireland. Whereas nationality, language, and religion are the meshes which Stephen struggles to fly from, he's vocal when he tells Mr. Deasy that history is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake. The narrative is suffused with references to colonialism, nationalism, anti-Semitism, the British Empire, that is, with the very serious political issues of its day. This is the predicament that all the characters find themselves in, no matter their side of the political divide. Ulysses raises a kind of double lens directed not only towards the fractures within Ireland, but also towards a fragmented, perplexed, and divided Europe. Moreover, a harsh criticism of the, and I'm quoting here from the novel, the brutish empire permeates it, summed up in the quip, beer, beef, business, Bibles, bulldogs, battleships, buggery, and bishops, and repeated by the Beatitudes amid the hallucinations in the Circe episode as beer, beef, battle dog, Bible, Bosnum, Barnum, Buggerum, bishop. Joyce interpurses the intricate narrative fabric with a wealth of historical references. By piercing the surface of its linguistic pyrotechnics, we find a true web whose threads interweave objective facts and events, subjective experience, and collective life. As in music, the two major forms of great epic literature, the epic, the foundation on which the Joycean edifice is built, and the novel, the construction that transforms and shuffles everything, undergo a contrapuntal treatment, as if they were two melodic lines that combine, interact, and contrast. In his overarching and ambitious project, Joyce meant this encyclopedic novel as an epic of two races, Israelite, God, and Irish, and at the same time the cycle of the human body, as well as a little story of a day. The reader needs to work through the layers that constitute its overall plot in order to grasp all the materials that go into its making. By encompassing individual life stories, one city, its history, its people, its culture, Ulysses aspires to totality, not the totality that Lukács contends, which entails a whole set of elements that are meaningfully interrelated in such a way that the essence of each element can only be understood in its relation to the others, but that which Joyce's recourse to the Homeric myth grants, the myth that, even if taken ironically, constitutes its framing. If on the one hand he burst the limits of the 19th century realist novel, Joyce, on the other hand, reorganized the wreckage by creating the epic of a common man grappling with his everyday affairs and problems in a God-forsaken world, as novels had done from their inception. While, as in a 19th century novel, adultery and the symbolic search of a son for a father and of a father for a son underlie the narrative, a plethora of characters and insignificant events fill the scenes in the episodes, weaving a complex, protean, and multifaceted fabric of life in a Dublin newly entering the 20th century. Out of heterogeneous fragments and variegated materials, the fabric recreates a sense of a social totality by grasping it in the individuals who are part of it. Against Lukács's claim that in the work of the major modernist writers, and I quote Lukács, man is by nature solitary, asocial, unable to enter into relationships with other human beings, Adorno argues that, and I quote, man's solitude is an inescapable fact of his existence, and that in an individualistic society, solitude is socially mediated and essentially historical in substance. Ulysses makes true the capacity of a literary narrative to open a totalizing and mapping access to society as a whole. It perfectly fits the definition of the novel as the epic of an age in which the extensive totality of life is no longer directly given, in which the immanence of meaning in life has become a problem, yet which still thinks in terms of totality. And I've been quoting Lukács here. Nonetheless, in his discussion of the modernists, Lukács came to criticize the formalist and subjective nature of their work, that he described as literary vanguard, because of their disfiguration of reality and depiction of what he believed to be unresponsive and distressed characters. According to Peter Hitchcock, Lukács was among the many Marxists who berated Joyce for his subjectivism, believing that the presentation of inward states of being served to detract from the action, praxis, needed to change the objective world. Rather than an anti-realist or vanguardist work, as Lukács would have it, Ulysses flaunts a new and different concept of realism. It does contradict the natural principle of epic selection, that is, selection of what is essential in life, as it has been described as a book in which everything happens and nothing happens. But Dublin is never mere background, never an incidental setting. On the contrary, it's a living organism, a site of interpersonal exchanges wherein the characters carry out their routine duties. It is Joyce's mastery in handling point of view and interior monologue that accounts for the reader's experience of the events of the day. Likewise, it's the wealth of details that enables social characterization. None of the three main characters in the novel stand out for their action or intervention in the world. They simply go about their daily errands and tasks. However, the patterns imposed by the Irish social, political, and religious problems, what Joyce refers to as church and state, filter through the interstices of the narrative and expose the anti-Semitism which Bloom, seen as an outsider, is a victim of throughout the day. The position of women, circumscribed to the domestic sphere and limited in their aspirations and opportunities. The Douglas family's destitution, the Dubliners' jingoism, Alan's predicament as a colonial state. So all of these are problems which are present and dealt with, rendered in the novel. Over and above the miniature cameo of the world we live in, quotation from Ulysses, Joyce depicts the greatness of daily life filtered by modern consciousness. Between topographic precision and myth, the pliable and flexible margins of the novel accommodate everyday reality and broaden in order to articulate it with the complexity of the world. Within very clear frames, one day, one city, three main characters, a structuring narrative thread, Joyce makes the imagination and language fly high. Once our modern Odysseus wanderings come to an end, in the early hours of morning, on his return to Eccles Street, listener, Molly, and narrator, Bloom, lying on their bed, are flung into the outer space by the power of the imagination and language. Here I should give a quotation of the novel, but I'm not going to because of the time pressure. Although there is a lot going on throughout the day, action in the Lucasian sense of change is completely absent in Ulysses, which explains why the Hungarian theorist claims there has been a divorce between the modernist novel and epic significance. Lacking is also the interaction of characters with world events, the principle of epic selection, distance, and perspective, some of the requirements Lukács also sets down in his appraisal of the narrative method. Joyce's technique not only avails itself both of description and narration with a clear predominance of the latter, but it also calls for a resignification of epic, not according to Lukács's interpretation, or epic in its classical sense, but in its modern attire and as a stylistic trait. With a split between individual and world, which has been a feature of the novel since its beginning, the protagonists no longer represent a collectivity, and the plunge in their subjectivity has significantly reduced or eliminated distance. It is an almost impossible task to identify and characterize the narrator, and one can hardly distinguish his voice from those of his dramatis personae. Furthermore, with all the hustle and bustle of the characters in the streets of Dublin, all of them completely immersed in the urban environment, activity and movement are scarcely in short supply. This is not properly action, as most of the time this activity and movement involve nothing more than the most trivial acts, which suggests a general acceptance of the status quo and paradoxically reinforces the hemiplegia of the will, which, according to Joyce, his countrymen suffered from. All those individual lives are interrelated by a common history and connected by a common destiny. A city, a people, and a nation speak through Joyce, who, in his all-encompassing scope, makes a multitude of voices resonate, lending his novel a symphonic quality. As much as Joyce's formal radicalism and modernist experimentation override and mask the narrative elements that have underpinned the novel genre since its inception, Ulysses tells the story of three characters, each one concerned with their own personal journey, looking after their own affairs, or not, in search of a meaning for their lives. They are the Telemachus, Odysseus, and Penelope of the modern day, who, thanks to metempsychosis, have reincarnated in Stephen, Leopold, and Molly. While manipulating a continuous parallel between contemporaneity and antiquity, which is one of the organizational frameworks of the novel, Joyce's is the epic of the metropolis under imperialism, in which the development of the bourgeoisie and proletariat alike is stunted by the benefit of a national petit bourgeoisie. It is through the interplay between the conventions of the novel and the unboundedness of the epic, between the individual and the collective, between the micro and macro levels, that Joyce challenges the form of the 19th century realist novel. Even if we observe the world from Stephen's or Bloom's perspective, in a way their status as outsiders simultaneously preserves and shortens the distance between them and the reader, which makes the novel flout, a superficial kind of realism. Joyce's critique, finishing. No, I'm not finishing. How much time do I have? I said I was not going to worry about, not going to ask you.
Take your time.
Can I take my time? I have about 3 more pages.
More than 10 minutes.
Okay. Joyce's critique and refusal of conventional surface realism, still according to the German philosopher, to Adorno, I'm talking here about, materialized as a rebellion against discursive language. He breaks down the fourth wall, stands against illusion, and collapses aesthetic distance through narrative stance. The external world is internalized, drawn into the interior space, and anything that takes place in the external world is presented as a piece of the internal world. This is a quotation from Adorno. In refutation of Lukács's argument, Ulysses, no doubt, counts among those contemporary novels that Adorno considered to be negative epics. The art of a world from which many traditional certainties had departed, as Bradbury and Macfarlane describe it, modernist literature represented the effort to shape the experience of the loss of meaning, the loss of stability, the loss of order in a world in crisis. The interest and investment in the subjective life of an individual mind, the close investigation of the flow of existence, are traits that characterize the change in the dialectical relation between the I and the world, the subject and the object. In face of the state of the world, fragmentation of both object and subject is rendered formally in the modernist novel in general, and in Ulysses in particular, which is for many the most famous example of the dissolution of the genre, insofar as it defies all the foundations and principles that had defined it. Polyphony, the impression of chaos, and stylistic plurality threaten to make the architecture collapse that holds the unobtrusive plot together. The division of the novel in 3 parts, the 3 main characters, Stephen, Leopold, and Molly, the father-son relationship replicated on several levels, the temporal and chronological signposts, the motives that subtly connect discrete scenes and episodes, and I'm not going to mention them here. So all of these, in fact, let's say that they make some of these things hold the plot together, and but we have to pay attention to these details, because otherwise we will have the impression that exactly the architectures are actually sort of collapsing, sort of breaking down, okay? From a structural perspective, the nexuses are practically indiscernible, pressing on the reader the demand to navigate this world in flux and try to penetrate its entrails. Each episode is distinct in terms of their form and style, while simultaneously referring to the whole. Plot development and the passage of time converge towards the 2 main events of that day: Stephen and Leopold's meeting late at night, and Leopold's return home after Boylan's visit to Molly. Alternately, issues arise that make Dublin into much more than simply a backdrop. It is rather a space in which the political, economic, and cultural relations between colony and empire establish inextricable links with the problem of Irish identity and of nationalism. Unlike the indifferent artist unconcernedly paring his fingernails, Joyce's interest in Irish politics finds expression mainly in episodes 7, Eulus, and 10, The Wandering Rocks, with their focus on the political character of the Irish nation and its political predicament, respectively, the master-servant trope, is one that recurs throughout the novel, as we know. As an element of that political character, Joyce depicts the ordinary Irish citizen as impoverished, idle, sentimental, nationalistic, and above all, alcoholic, a portrait of futility. And I'm quoting him, Stanley Sultan. Whereas hints of and references to Ireland's dependency are scattered everywhere in the text. The famous exactness with which Joyce reconstructs Dublin settings, the pubs and shops, the buildings, the bridges, the streets, while also shuffling everything, the remaking of biographical material, the characters based on acquaintances and real people, the incorporation of information provided by his brother Stanislaus and Aunt Josephine Murray, the bodily functions, the mind at work, the narrative styles, everything in Ulysses helps create a counterpoint between the realistic and anti-realistic drives in Joyce's effort to search for what underlies the surface of life, as he made explicit in his conversation with Arthur Power. In lieu of the extensive totality of life, whose outward form in the novel is essentially biographical, Leopold Bloom's biography takes shape as a result of what we learn about his individual life by following him for a few hours, in a plot line in which action amounts to ordinary and routine events. However, his life story ends up by emerging by way of a layered approach to his interiority, in which thoughts, impressions, and reflections which respond to the external world mingle with the memory of past moments and events. His courtship of Molly and their marriage, the loss of their son Rudy, his relationship with and concerns about their daughter Millie, his father's suicide. Bloom's day begins with breakfast, and once out in the street, there follow his going to a post office, a church, a chemist's shop, a Turkish bath, a funeral, the newspaper, a pub for a snack, the National Library, a hotel for lunch, a tavern, then a break on the beach, a visit to the hospital. His going to the brothel, now with Stephen, a stop for a cup of coffee, and finally his return home for a cup of chocolate, a chat with Stephen, and with the latter's departure to his and Molly's bed. All of that is interspersed with Stephen's wanderings, from Stephen's departure from the Martello Tower in the early morning up to his meeting with Bloom late at night, and also with the scenes involving Molly, who awaits Blaze's Boylan visit at home. This framework is filled with a multiplicity of other small events, dozens of characters, places, vehicles, sounds, movement, minutiae, colors, which added to the references to historical facts and figures, and literary personalities, offer a panorama of Irish society at the beginning of the 20th century, therein grounding the novel. Underlying his surface flows Stephen's, Bloom's, and Molly's mental lives by means of associations, recollections, soliloquies, interior monologues, digressions, a jumble in which fragments, incomplete sentences, overlapping phrases strive to reproduce the to and fro of consciousness. Thus, Bloom's traits as a modern man are revealed, the split resulting from his triple conditions as Jewish, Protestant, and Catholic, his isolation and feeling of exile in his own land, as if he were in search of a homeland. He's a pacifist, good and decent individual whose needs and desires we get to know thanks to the handling of perspective very close to his own. An empathetic human being whose common and devalued status reminds one of the myth of the wandering Jew, in addition to the parallel with Odysseus. Bloom is the problematic hero, an outcast whose humanity makes him at the same time representative of human qualities and experiences, a simultaneously singular and universal figure. Stephen is, in turn, the young Irishman with a Jesuit formation who carries in his name the conjunction of the first Christian martyr, of Daedalus and Icarus, with their mythological resonances, while he's also Telemachus in search of his father. Molly, the carnal and voluptuous Irishwoman, is both Calypso and Penelope. For some, she is the archetypical female. If Joyce seems to have regretted having shared the table of references to the Odyssey with some of his first interlocutors, the Homeric resonances have continued to form part of the critical readings of the novel. Be that as it may, once the Joycean building was erected, the Homeric parallel, a kind of scaffolding used by Joyce, came to be, as in any construction, completely dismantled once the work was completed, notwithstanding the echoes obtained. Joyce's definition of Ulysses as an epic of two races, the cycle of human body, and a little story of a day, seems to embody an impulse towards totality, which gets blurred by fragmentation. The intention, and I quote him again, to transpose the myth sub specie temporis nostri, occasions a permanent tension between two forces that converse, confirm, and revoke each other throughout hundreds of pages, between part and whole, particular and general, epic and novel, subjectivity and objectivity, chronology and the break with chronological order, primacy of character over plot, unities of time, of place, of action on the one hand, and multiplicity of events and illusion of simultaneity on the other. I'm coming close to the end. I'm not coming too close to the end. I'm going to skip a few things here, because, but what can I skip here? Well, let me go here. Joyce's struggle against the objective has brought about a re-evaluation of the relationship between art and reality. Point of view becomes subjective, but one cannot agree with Lukács that Joyce saw reality as an incoherent stream of consciousness. Apart from the very material, external elements that create a remarkably palpable environment in the novel, the world penetrates the narrative. For example, by means of the nationalist and anti-Semitic frame of mind that condemns Bloom to ostracism and loneliness, since he does not share his countrymen's ideas. Antagonism manifests itself on several occasions, but becomes more evident in episode 12, Cyclops, in which Bloom confronts the citizen. And here I have a long quotation from the novel, which I will not be able to read, because otherwise, it's but basically here he has to deal with the hostility and he's also, let's say, in a way distinguished from the other customers, because he reminds them he's Jewish, and he says I belong to a race, that, says Bloom, that is hated and persecuted, and then he actually asks himself here, what is a nation? What does a nation mean? Okay, and then when the citizen, who is his antagonist in this episode, asks him, because they see him as an outsider, what is your nation, if I may ask? Says the citizen, and Bloom answers, Ireland. Says Bloom, I was born here, Ireland. So the violence and hatred that transpire in the conversation throughout the episode materialize in the citizens hurling a biscuit tin box at Bloom. His gesture contrasts with Bloom's attitude, whose experience of uprootedness seems to allow him a certain distancing from extreme positions. So even though indirect and fleeting, references to the historical context help situate the conflicts, parodied and downplayed here, which had occurred in Ireland at the end of the 19th century. The struggle for self-rule, led by Charles Stewart Parnell, the political rift between Unionists and Nationalists, the split between the pro-Parnell and the anti-Parnell in the Irish Parliamentary Party. Years of tension would lead to the Easter Revolution in 1916 for the Irish right to freedom and sovereignty. The movement climaxed, as we know, with the execution of 15 rebels and the prison of more than 3,500 men and women by Westminster. The outbreak of the Great War, however, drew attention from Ireland and turned it to continental Europe. Though mostly written during this period, 1914 to 1921, Ulysses doubles its focus. And in Finnegan's Wake, there's a very interesting phrase. He says, doubling by circulars. So that's what Ulysses does as well. It doubles its focus by keeping two temporal perspectives. The 1904 Dublin and the context of the novel's composition. Joyce's reply to Mrs. Sheehy Skeffington, I never know how to pronounce these Irish names, when she asked him why he did not return to Dublin, became famous. When she asks him why doesn't he return to Dublin, he answers, have I ever left it? Okay, so that's this idea that it's there all the time, and Dublin is something that is absolutely present to him. So, and I'm coming to an end now. So to his friend, Constantine Curran, in its turn, Joyce wrote when urged to visit the city. He says, every day, in every way, I'm walking along the streets of Dublin, along the Strand, and hearing voices. Non dico giammai, ma non ancora. And that's how he finishes that's the end of the quotation. So Joyce meant to be, and I'm quoting him, an adventurer above all, willing to take every risk and be prepared to founder in his effort if need be. With him, there is definitely a renovation of the genre, without its disowning itself, without its reneging on its essential principles. And that's the end of it. Sorry if I have used more than I should have of my time.
Okay, thanks, Sandra. Just one question. What is the translation of this sentence? Is Italian, I suppose.
Non dico giammai, ma non ancora. I never say never, but not now.
Okay.
Because they used Italian at home, and okay. he lived in Trieste, as you know, and they used Italian at home, and he spoke Italian, so he uses that sentence.
Okay.
I don't say never, but not now.
Okay. Thanks, Sandra. Virginia? Virginia?
Sim, é só que eu coloquei como se fossem duas perguntas, mas é uma só.
Okay. Yes. Thanks, Virginia. We have a question from Samuel, right? To
Lynn.
I have two questions to Lynn and then to Sandra, and then we can go to Samuel's. Okay, is that right for you?
It's fine with me. No
Yes.
problem.
Okay.
Yep, okay.
Lynn, if you could develop the idea right in the beginning of your lecture, you mentioned bringing the body back. This notion of bringing the body back, just to develop on that. I think it's quite interesting that idea. And the other aspect that you mentioned, if you could develop on that also, that transmodernity is not against anti-modernity, right? And as you said, the idea of transmodernity is a little bit, if I understood correctly, is beyond these traditional ways of modernity that we have till today. Just for you, if you could develop that, okay, just do aspects. And Sandra,
Yes.
Extremely broad question, extremely
No,
open.
then I refuse to answer. If it's
No,
broad, I
okay,
refuse to
but
answer.
if the idea of in your vision, what's the legacy of Ulysses for the history of the novel, right? This is one question. It's not so, yes, very
It's very
complicated.
simple. I could write a thesis about that,
Yeah,
right?
so, but if you had, for instance, if you had to explain to Antonio Bispo, that person mentioned by Linz in his, why James Joyce is so important, because in a way James Joyce was breaking a lot of rules, right?
Yes.
He was going against the grain, and in a sense, if I understood quite correctly, Antonio Bispo is proposing some of like that. Okay, Lee?
Something like, yes, it's also breaking the rules.
Yes, yes. If you could just to you know to reflect upon this idea, why? What's the main legacy of it? And the another aspect is maybe it's related to this question. Your favorite characters of Ulysses, right? If someone asked you what's your favorite aspect, your favorite dimension, I don't know, this kind of
Yeah.
okay. And then then you have this the question by Samuel, right? Thanks, Virginia, for sending us here. It's for Lean, right? Decoloniality ideas influence some contemporary thoughts and indigenous languages translation, especially from anthropology. How translators could have a decolonial position in face of non-hegemonic languages and cultures, and about endangered languages and cultures. How decoloniality ideals could help. Okay, this is the one. Lee?
Lynn.
So I begin, is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
No. Yeah, the microphone. Yeah. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so the first question was bringing the body back, to expand on bringing the body back. Yeah. So the first thing is, where do I get this? This comes from the idea, firstly, one of the concepts which was very much criticized by post-colonial, by anti-colonial, post-colonial, and now decolonial theorists, was who questioned the concept of universality, right? The concept of universality, which exists behind concepts which don't have a modifier, or what I also called the unmarked concepts. For example, we talk about music, classical music, and then we talk about African music, Asian music, indigenous music, or whatever. All right. Or we talk about science, no qualifier, and then we talk about indigenous science, traditional science. So all of these terms, which this was basically what Edward Said in Orientalism was trying to get at in a different way. So whose knowledge is universal and unmarked, and whose knowledge is always local, right? Now, this was a very conscious, for us who lived through coloniality as being the colonized. It was very clear that certain knowledges were unmarked; they were considered to be standard, and other knowledges are always considered to be local, right? So we had, in my personal experience, we had our language and we had English, as if English was the language of everybody, right? And all other languages were local. So it's this concept of universality which is being, for example, what Edward Said tried to show is that Orientalism was a perspective of the West, right? Orientalism didn't describe a particular reality per se. It described a particular gaze, a particular perspective. right? Now, in order to identify a particular perspective, it's not sufficient to say we have a perspective here, because the importance is to bring the body that is gazing, the body that is looking. So when we bring that body into the perspective, then we're not just talking about substituting one perspective for another, or we have a multitude of perspectives which are all equal. What's missing is bringing the location of a particular perspective. And in my work, to bring that location, now we have all kinds of terminology in these theories. We have the terminology of positionality. We have the terminology of perspectivalism, which is in the basis of the question by Samuel, for example. But we don't have the concept, it's not emphasized the fact that all of these things are related to bodies located in specific contexts with specific histories and ideologies. So it's not a neutral concept of positionality or perspective. I call it bringing the body back, because I want the history of a particular body to be connected with the theories, the knowledge, or the interpretation of the perspective of that body. By calling it a body, I want to humanize, I want to reduce it from a gigantic kind of a universal interpretation to the interpretation of a social subject, someone who's a product of a particular discourse and ideology, someone who is human like anyone else. So when we bring the body back, we bring essentially subjectivity back, right? Because the body feels, the body is just not, it's not simply rational. Rationality tends to hide the body, which is also irrational, non-rational, which has feelings and affects, which can like and not like, which can have prejudices, etc. Right? So when we bring the body back, I want to bring subjectivity into the picture, and not subjectivity in the sense of individuality as anything goes. Subjectivity in the sense of always socio-historically located. So yes, we are social subjects, but it doesn't mean we're all alike. Our individuality arises when the discourses that constitute us as social subjects vary. They're not all, the discourses that constitute us are not all identical. We're not all interested in the same things. We're not all affected by the same discourses in the same way. Now, our particularities can be emphasized when we talk about our bodies. And also because the main thing about the body that I consider is when, in my work on racism, right? The importance of the body. We have many of my, for example, white colleagues who don't want to talk about racism because they feel, I can't talk about racism because I'm white. What do you mean? So if you're white, because you don't suffer racism, so it's not your problem. But you, in your silence, by being white, you're contributing to the institution of which you and me are part that promulgates racism, right? So yes, you have to bring your body into the picture. It may be painful for you to speak of racism being white and being anti-racist. So why do you feel that you don't have a voice to speak about racism? So the body is there. The same way as I can be black and I can vote for Bolsonaro and racism. As you know, the Bolsonaro government had important people occupying important positions who are black and who claim there's no racism, and racism is a product of racists, etc., right? And we're not racists. So to bring the body back is to bring the complexity of socio-historic location, positionality, and everything that affects us, which is not just rational. Right? I don't know if that was clear, but it comes together with the idea of marking the unmarked, de-universalizing knowledge. Right? Your second question was on, I forget, Danielle. You talked about one was on the body, and the second one was on
transmodernity.
Transmodern.
It's not anti-modernity.
Yeah, because what Dussel says, it's his concept, transmodernity, and he's speaking as a Marxist, right? So his critique, he's saying we are not rejecting modernity and what it has taught us, right? So if we reject, and this is a very, very common misrepresentation of decoloniality. If I want to be decolonial, I have to reject everything that comes from the global north, right? That's not true. We are constituted by the epistemologies of the global north. So we can't stop being who we are. We can interrogate ourselves and question ourselves. We can reflect on our complicity with the global north, especially us in Brazil, right? We are complicit, so we have to be critical about our complicity in order to be able to interrupt this complicity, right? So whether we like it or not, if we've been colonized, if we are academics at an elite university, we are using especially in the humanities, all our theories come from the global north. We cannot turn our backs on the global north. We have to rethink our positions in relation to the global north. So we're not anti-colonial or anti-Western. What we are saying is that at the same time as we are epistemologically products of the global north,
Lane? I think that we lost connection.
Bravo. I
Lane?
think it froze. It froze. I think we have to wait.
Oops. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now.
Sorry. Can I go on?
Yeah,
I came back now.
Okay. Yeah, I think I lost the connection. So we have to, I was referring to the work that we know, for example, Davi Kopenawa, Ailton Krenak, all of these indigenous thinkers who have not been translated into, or maybe they have not been translated into English, but they can help us who also read Western knowledges to rethink our Western knowledges or to add things to the way we think using Western knowledges. This is transmodernity. It's not to reject what we got from colonization. It's to relocate, to reconsider, to bring other knowledges in dialogue with Western knowledges. So it's not to invert the situation, right? Now the third question was about you said from Samuel about translating indigenous knowledges and the work of Vives de Castro. Yes, very important, the work of Vives de Castro, and I particularly read Vives de Castro as one of our Brazilian decolonial thinkers, even though probably he would not like that. I mean, why do we have to attribute our names to others, right? But we can read him. I read him as a decolonial thinker, especially his concept of translation. And it's connected to what I mentioned when I said linguistics, and here I'm speaking as a linguist. Linguistics prays in the church of Saussure, right? Now, Saussure's thinking of language, his theories of language they haven't dropped from the skies. They come from a reflection that he himself made on his reality, right? So the languages of Europe, the idea when he preferred to system, for example, he preferred to analyze language in its systematic aspect rather from language in its use aspect, which was very complicated and didn't behave itself, or as he said, the use of language doesn't stand still for a photograph, right? And in order to analyze language, we need to take a photograph, meaning we have to freeze language in its dynamism in order to perceive the system in language, right? Now, he was presupposing the concept of system, which is always in the singular. And the concept of system brings with it a particular view of language, that language is rule-governed. It brings with a particular tradition, which is a European tradition of philology, of looking at the past and of modernity. Saussure was very much modern because he made a huge difference between the previous tradition of looking of language in Europe, which was philology, with linguistics, which is looking at language from simultaneity, suspending history, whereas philology privileged history. Now, what I'm saying here is the way we look at language is always dependent on our bodies, meaning where we are speaking from, what we know, where we are located. Saussure was Swiss, as you may know, French Swiss. So he was familiar to the concept of language in Switzerland or in Europe in general. Language occupies territory and the territory is bordered. So even though we may think that Switzerland is multilingual, it isn't. Switzerland has several monolingual territories. So in French Switzerland, they speak French. In German Switzerland, they speak German. In Italian Switzerland, they speak Italian and Romansh or whatever, right? So this is a general idea that Europeans have. If you are in France, you speak French. If you're in Germany, you speak German, etc. Territory goes together with language. So language is bordered and bounded, right? And so language is always in the singular. This comes from a European experience of language. Now, in indigenous languages, we have a very different experience. In indigenous languages in Brazil, one of a large percentage of indigenous cultures in Brazil are exogamous, meaning they marry people from outside their community. And these people who come from outside their community bring different languages to the family. So the important thing about indigenous communities is that they can't think of language as being singular and bounded. Language has to be complex, material, heterogeneous. Same thing if we go to Africa or India. It's not areas, territories which are multilingual. It's people who are multilingual. Every Indian, for example, speaks at least 4 languages. Right? Every Indian, no matter in what territory he is. So there's no connection between language and territory. So if we had to look at language from the perspective of an indigenous person in Brazil or the perspective of an Indian from India, we wouldn't see language beginning with system or grammar. We would see language beginning with the user. What do I do when I don't know, when I meet someone I don't know? Out of all the languages I speak and the languages that person speaks, how do I behave? It's not a question of being correct or incorrect. I first have to discuss, try to find out and negotiate what language do I speak with that person. So it's a totally different way of looking at language. And one of the concepts of Vives de Castro is the concept of equivocal translation. So for him, translation, and this concept comes from indigenous languages, where the basic idea of equivocal translation of Vives de Castro is the idea that not understanding is also understanding. That is such a fundamental concept in translation, because in our traditional concepts of translation, everything is translatable, right? Until we get to the Italian traduttore, traditore, right? So not everything is translatable. And the fact that things are not translatable doesn't mean that we stop communicating. This is something we learn from indigenous communities. Things which are not translatable are still negotiable. An aspect of language which indigenous languages have and which Saussure did not have is evidentials. So in indigenous languages, they have a suffix which refers, which means from my perspective. One suffix which says, so indigenous languages cannot say it's called or that's not true. They need to put the suffix which says, from my perspective, it's called, from my perspective, it's not true, or from everybody's perspective. From everybody's perspective is a suffix which is used to refer to collective knowledge, to science, to history. Okay, so these are things which in linguistics we call evidentials, but they not form part of Saussure's way of thinking because they are not part of the reality of European languages. Right? So this is the question coincides with what I say about bringing the body back. So when we are linguists, when we are using linguistic theories, let's think about where are we thinking language from? Let's not just suppose that our theories, our concepts of grammar and structure and phonology apply to everyone everywhere. Right? Well, I hope I answered the questions.
Thanks, Lynn. Sandra?
The legacy?
Yeah.
I think perhaps I can summarize it in one word. Freedom.
Freedom?
Freedom.
In which sense?
The freedom to do anything, the freedom to take, to take your materials and work them out any way you think your materials make sense to you or to your collectivity, to your group. I think, because because after there's nothing. I think there's. I haven't read David. Oh God, Foster Wallace. I haven't read him yet. I may at some point. Not right now. Before I read David Foster Wallace, I still have to read Finnegan's Wake, which is, a task for when I really retire. Mm-hmm. But I would say that, after Ulysses and after Finnegan's Wake, where can you go? Where can a novelist go from there? So it's difficult to think about it in terms of form or in terms of ideas. I don't know. So I would say freedom, because I one of the things that I admire about Ulysses is the freedom with which Joyce dealt with tradition and with his own present, with the past and the present, and it's all there in the novel. And I don't know, because if you it's difficult to give an answer thinking of the enormous amount of novels written and published everywhere. But from what I know, from my perspective, to use Lynn's suggestion, right? From my perspective, I think that's from what I know. That's what I would say. It's a very general thing, but it's what impresses me. Mm-hmm. And for I don't know if that answers your question, but for your second question, my favorite characteristic, right?
Yeah.
I love the way he created Bloom. Bloom is a wonderful, absolutely incredible creation as a character, and I think what I really like about the novel it's humor. It's a very funny novel. A very funny novel. Mm-hmm. I don't know if not everybody agrees, but I have the Ulysses translator, Caetano Galindo, who's a very good friend of mine. We agree on that. I know we that's our common. Every time we talk about Ulysses, this is something we always repeat. It's the funny thing that we see in the novel, and our love for Bloom. We have that in common.
Okay.
I don't think that's a very sort of critical answer from a literary perspective, but anyway.
I didn't want a literary perspective.
Okay, then there
So
you go.
in that sense, I have two more questions because I don't know if I don't know if we both for Lynn and for you, Sandra. For Lynn, one aspect that you dislike, that you don't like in the decolonial theory, and one thing, Sandra, that you dislike in Ulysses.
In Ulysses.
Yes. Okay. Lynn.
First, Daniel, could I make a connection with Sandra's answer?
Perfect.
Sandra referred to my term perspectivism, and I like that when Sandra's answer where she said freedom, right? What's the characteristic? Now, connecting freedom to perspective, I'd just like to make that connection. It reminds me of what happened in the case of a Nigerian novelist called Amos Tutuola, who was writing in the 50s and the 60s. Right? Now, Amos Tutuola was basically, this is before Nigerian independence, he was a continuo, or in the colonial word in English was peon, right? He was a continuo of a repartição pública colonial in the British colonial system, right? So he spent all day stamping papers or delivering documents. Now, he had only 2 years of primary school in English. And so what he did with the time that he had free, and this is one aspect of the freedom, he started putting on paper all the stories that his community, all the oral tradition, the stories of the oral tradition of his community, but obviously putting it on paper, they acquired a kind of linearity which the oral tradition doesn't have, right? So he stopped perhaps at something which looked like a novel. And what he did is, because he was the one who delivered letters put letters in the mail, in the post office, he knew all the addresses of the publishers in London. Right? So what he did was he sent his manuscript to all of these publishers in London. This story, this kind of novel which he wrote, which was, it has characteristics it shares characteristics with Ulysses. It's non-linear. Characters come in, come out, and you have to pay a lot of attention. You don't know if it's epic or if it's, if it's a personal. What's the word?
Memoir.
No, thinking the Virginia Woolf word.
Stream of consciousness.
Stream of consciousness. It's somewhere between epic and stream of consciousness. Yeah. And its English is minimally grammatical because he only had 2 years of schooling in English. Anyway, he sent this manuscript to various publishers in London. Most of them rejected it. And then one publisher, which was, I forget what publisher it is now, but one of the great publishers at the time in London, sent it to a reviewer who happened to be Dylan Thomas. Dylan Thomas, the Welsh poet.
The Welsh poet.
Yeah, and Dylan Thomas was working part-time as a reviewer for this publisher to get some extra money because he couldn't live on his work as a poet. And Dylan Thomas, besides being part of the modernistic tradition of poetry, he was a reader of Joyce, right? So when he opened this manuscript, he enthusiastically said, wow, what a creative piece of work. And obviously then you have the colonial racism coming out of Africa, something like Joyce coming out of Africa, wonderful. He recommended it for publication. It was published, and Amos Tutuola became one of the first published authors of Nigeria, right? and very much praised by the British colonial authorities. But the other Nigerian author called Chinua Achebe, or the playwright Wole Soyinka, who worked in much more academic, traditional, and these were readers of literature, of British literature, they were appalled. They said, just a minute, this guy doesn't even write English properly because he doesn't speak English properly. He's not being creative. He's just doing what he knows, right? All of these stories come from his community. So he hasn't invented anything. And they read his novel first as not a novel, stories which have been mishmashed together, right? And a disgrace. And they say, this guy is a disgrace to us Nigerians, and he's a product of British racism, because here they don't look at my work, they don't look at Soyinka's work, they look at this work because they believe that us as Nigerians are incapable of producing good literature. Now, for them, good literature has to look like James Joyce's Ulysses, right? And there we have, this discussion went on during Nigerian independence. After, when the Nigerians were fighting for independence, they needed national symbols. They forgot, they told Chinua Achebe and Wole Soyinka to be quiet. They said, we need a national symbol of Nigerian culture for the Europeans, especially the British, to respect us. They think Amos Tutwala is a great Nigerian writer. So do we. So they said, we are prepared to be a nation because we already have a great writer recognized by Europe. So this is the story of Amos Tutwala. Freedom, yes, he was free, right? And then you have freedom to do what, right? And how freedom can be interpreted. And here I'm connecting your concept of freedom, Sandra, with the concept of body and contextualization and socio-historic biography playing a part. Huh? Sorry.
Oh, that was a very, very interesting story. Very, very interesting.
Sorry, I forgot the question you had to me.
Yeah, well, there was a question.
Yeah, one aspect in decolonial theory that
I don't like.
Don't like.
Yeah, I can tell you, it's decolonial theory has now become in Brazil a fashion, a bandwagon, right?
That's everything.
Everyone is doing decolonial theory, and for me, the important thing, and I say my decolonial pedagogy is identify, interrogate, interrupt, right? So before you want to become decolonial, so even Paulo Freire now has become decolonial, right? So before you want to declare the whole world decolonial, decolonize yourself, because this tradition of importing theories from outside and wanting to regurgitate theories from outside is part of our coloniality. So it's not being decolonial by you wanting, if everybody wants to be decolonial, they're in fact being more colonial than decolonial. So just to be difficult, that's what I don't like.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Lynn. Sandra?
I don't know. It's a very difficult question because I like it very, very much. Maybe, well, the same way I really, really like Bloom, I dislike Stephen as a character.
Uh-huh. And why?
There's a sense of self-importance, no, I pity him because, I mean, there's lots of, now we are going into a very, very personal sort of reading of the character. But, you know, he has a very difficult story, life story. But, I mean, he's also very conceited. And if I have already used a sentence in Italian, reading or quoting from Joyce, but I would say to use a French phrase now, he's he's what I would describe as rempli de soi-même. Too full of himself, I would say. But anyway, but he's a very interesting character. Very interesting.
Okay.
But maybe I don't like Joyce because he wrote Finnegan's Wake, which I find difficult to read.
You say that not Ulysses, but you don't like Joyce. Is this because of the Finnegan's Wake?
No, yeah, I don't like Joyce because he wrote Finnegan's Wake after Ulysses, and then
okay.
It's such a challenge to every single reader.
I love Finnegan's Wake.
Sorry?
I love Finnegan's Wake.
Oh, of course. I mean, there's all sorts of languages.
Yeah.
No, yes. I mean, it's something. But anyway, no, this is just a joke. It's just sort of repeating the same sort of thing about the impossibility of traversing, let's say, of reading Finnegan's Wake. But I mean. Okay. No, but he's a very interesting writer, and what I like, there's something that I perhaps should say that I also like very much about Joyce. The fact that he's very into whatever is common in life, all in let's say at all levels of life, whatever is common, and it's also Bloom's.
In the sense of ordinary, or in the sense of what's the communal? What's the
in both senses?
Okay.
But also in the sense.
Lost Sandra. Wait some minutes. Yeah. Modern times.
Mine froze now.
Yeah. You're back.
No, I was just saying that common in the sense of ordinary, in the sense that, they're people like us. There's nothing heroic about them. Nothing, absolutely nothing. And they don't have any sort of ambitions, any sort of, they're just living their normal lives.
Okay. Wonderful. Lynn, Sandra, would you like to add some final words, some final thoughts that you'd like to?
No, I think we've had a very nice chat, in fact. And I'm also thankful because I would like to thank Lynn for his presentation on decoloniality, because people talk, exactly as you said, people talk so much about it. It took me a while to understand what it was all about, but I mean, now you made it sort of, clear and theoretical, let's say.
Thank you. Yeah, I have nothing else to add. I think thank you for the organizers and
yes,
this the possibility of discussing things which in our daily academic lives we don't have. So this is an important opportunity. Thank you to EPOGELLI.
Yes, I would like to thank the students as well for organizing everything and for the invitation. And thank you, Danielle, for being our mediator.
Yeah, thank you for the instigating questions, Danielle.
Yeah. Eu também queria agradecer ao Miraldo por dar nosso apoio aí para a transmissão do YouTube, né? Eu não sei, Virgínia, Thaís, que estão aqui com a gente, representando, vocês gostariam de falar alguma coisa? Não sei, sobre...
Não, acho que em nome da comissão, eu gostaria de agradecer a todos os professores que ouviram nosso chamado e contribuíram com coisas tão interessantes, e foi bastante rico, e eu acho que o evento foi uma oportunidade mesmo, como vocês falaram, da gente ter esse tempo, né, de congregar com o resto das pessoas no programa, né, tanto os alunos quanto os professores, e eu só tenho a agradecer mesmo. Obrigada a todos vocês.
Obrigado, Virgínia. A gente que tem que agradecer. É muito bacana mesmo o evento. Foi uma conversa muito legal. Podemos encerrar então, pessoal? A Laura que escreveu. Acho que a Laura escreveu, não sei se... a Virgínia passou. Obrigado. A Laura estava na comissão de organização. Obrigado, Laura, pela organização, né? E a todos os estudantes. Foi muito bem organizado, deram um duro danado ainda Ok. Tenha uma boa noite, então. Espero que a gente se veja em breve.
Boa noite.
Eu
Tchau, tchau.
espero. Boa noite, pessoal.